Good evening, everyone. I'm Keegan, the director of the Military Aviation Museum. Um, it is my great pleasure this evening to welcome you all to another installment of our ongoing webinar series. As usual, we continue to hope that all of you are at home practicing social distancing and are safe and well during this unprecedented health crisis. And hopefully, we'll be able to provide you some entertainment this evening as we explore one of the museum's most precious and unique artifacts with Mike Potter, former director of the Military Aviation Museum, current board member, and perhaps most esteemed of all, project leader on the restoration of the Goxhill Watch Office here at the museum. Before we get stuck in, as usual, we've got a couple housekeeping things. We'd love to have you support us, make a contribution through the Military Aviation Museum's website. Those contributions are what is helping us deliver these great webinar programs, as well as keep them free at the point of delivery. It does cost us some money to purchase the software necessary to host these, and we pay it monthly. We'll continue to do that for the duration of the closure of the museum, and again, all support is certainly appreciated. So, with that all said, it is time to welcome Mike Potter. Mike is, as I said, a board member of the Military Aviation Museum. He is by vocation a former community banker and consultant. But Mike, like many of us, has a passion for aviation and for flying. He's owned several aircraft, is an instrument-rated pilot, but has been actively involved with warbirds or historic aircraft for the last 40 or so years. Mike, take it away.
Thank you very much, Keegan, and good evening, everybody. I'm going to try to set a record tonight for the shortest webinar to date. If you see your screen go blank, that's because Keegan just hit the kill switch to keep me from going to 2 hours, like I think happened once before to us. Very briefly, this presentation is going to walk through the following areas. First of all, a brief talk about the run-up and preparation for the air war in Europe. Second, how the British managed to turn their island into a giant aircraft carrier. Third, how RAF Goxhill, as an example, was selected and built. Number four, the story behind how a restored Goxhill Watch Office came to Virginia. And finally, the philosophy and the current state of the Goxhill guest experience. Thinking back, we've all read the same books and we've all seen the same movies and the same newsreels. Back in the 1930s, the Depression was holding German production back, and the number of airframe plants rose from 2,800 to 38,000 in just 2 years. So this was staggering. This rearming was becoming so rapid that in 1933, 6 brand new aircraft manufacturers joined the 7 already established in Germany, and they were all diversifying from other engineering areas to begin aircraft manufacture. By 1935, the total number of airframe and aero engine plants had risen to an astonishing 54,000, an increase of nearly 50,000 in just 2 years. Everything about the Second World War in terms of logistics is just absolutely mind-boggling, and we'll touch on a few pieces of this. This incredible increase was highlighted in a letter from Winston Churchill to Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, 3 times British Prime Minister, in 1935. Churchill pointed out that, quote, "I believe that the Germans are already as strong as we are and possibly stronger, and that if we carry out our new program as prescribed, Germany will still be 50% stronger than we will be by the end of 1935 or the beginning of 1936. Well, despite no less than a dozen or so proposed parliamentary schemes to upgrade the Royal Air Force, the comments were prescient, because here's the relative strength of the air forces of Germany and the Royal Air Force in July of 1940. And as you can see from the sidebars, England was in a rather woeful state and still launching not just a handful of antique biplanes at their conditions. So his prediction was certainly came true, even though Parliament funded multiple expansion period schemes, and that by the outbreak of the war, the RAF had less than half of the force of the Luftwaffe. Royal Air Force Fighter Command in particular possessed only about 1,500 airplanes, of which many were already outdated or inadequate. Bomber Command had 920 aircraft, but nothing bigger than a twin engine plane with very limited capabilities. The dramatic growth of these air forces brought not only newer and better planes, but vastly different types, and improving performance dictated the formation of previously unimaginable numbers of new groups, squadrons, and airfields. Only a handful of existing airfields in the mid 1930s were capable of supporting the equipment that would be in use even early in the war. By 1939, in all of the United Kingdom, only 9 airfields had hard runways of any sort whatsoever. Let's remember that going back to the Great War, an aerodrome was nothing but a mile-wide circle of grass, and it was still very much the same in 1935. Let's remember what typical airfields look like in the pre-war years specifically. Here's an example of one of the larger grass fields in England in 1935. It's Heston Aerodrome west of London. A very simple grass field where in 1938, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain waved his famous piece of paper in the air proclaiming peace in our time after weekly meetings with Herr Hitler. So that was one of the better airports in and around London in the mid 1930s, obviously still grass. So how indeed does a government turn 7,000 square miles of quiet, bucolic countryside in East Anglia, on the eastern part of the middle part of England, into what was described by several authors as a giant aircraft carrier anchored off of the northwest coast of Europe? Well, for starters, any area that was below 50 feet above sea level, or about 650 feet above 650, was generally ignored, the former being prone to flooding and the latter suffering high levels of cloud and fog, omnipresent fog in England. Next, a circle with a radius of 1,100 yards was marked off, and this all had to be flat with very minimal change in the ground layer. It also had to be free from obstructions and ideally at least 3 miles away from any other flying location. As many of us know, looking at some of the maps, and we'll see an example of that later, it was not possible to fly more than about 30 seconds over your own airfield in the middle of World War II without interfering in the traffic pattern of the next airfield. They were crammed in like sardines from Lincolnshire down to Dover. Next, officers from the Air Ministry's aerodrome boards would walk the site physically, field by field, recording maximum landing distances, which of course were for the planes then existing, not the ones that would exist in just a short year or two. And they noted any unidentified obstacles, trees, hedges, ditches, or more permanent structures that would need removal. By September of 39, board officials had identified, examined, and recorded over 4,000 possible sites in the United Kingdom. Many would be simply filed away, never to see any aviation of any kind, while others would become famous for years to come. Once a suitable site had been identified and examined, the local geology had to be established where possible. In the pre-war years, no consideration was given to hard runways. They didn't have to worry about that. They didn't see any need for aircraft that would be bogging down in existing runways. But given the planes that were coming up from World War II, in order to prevent aircraft wheels from bogging down or flooding closing an airfield, you had to have very well-drained soils. That was absolutely paramount. In many parts of England are a great deal like Virginia Beach. You dig down a very short distance, you find very wet, soggy clay that makes for a really lousy underlaying for a tarmac or pavement or concrete runway. So once the sites had been accepted, the land was requisitioned and forcibly purchased using the new powers granted under the Emergency Powers Defense Act of 1939. This gave virtually immediate access and ownership of the land with little notice to the landowner by the government. There was no NIMBY problem back then. They walked your land in the morning and you no longer owned it by the late afternoon. So by the outbreak of war, 100 sites had been purchased. That number was relatively small, and the board was able to be very particular in their choice, something that was thrown out the window within another 12 months in the need for dramatically larger and larger number of airfields. Airfields are highly labor-intensive projects. They require an enormous workforce and extensive heavy machinery, little of which was available in the early 1940s. Irish labor provided the backbone of the initial workforce. A heavy plant came from the United States under the Lend-Lease program. And at its peak, there were some 60,000 men employed strictly on airfield construction. all of whom were unable to spend their time rebuilding the devastated towns and cities of the UK. In 1942, of course, the United States joined the theater and sent their own engineer aviation battalions to the United Kingdom. Their task supplemented the British squadrons by building their own airfields ready for the huge influx of men and machines that was about to arrive, in addition to the fields like Gox Hill that were given over by the Air Ministry to the newly arriving United States Army Air Forces. In fact, the Americans opened their first self-built field in 1943. Okay, here's a mind-boggling number for you. In 1939, there were only 60 military airfields in the entirety of the United Kingdom. By 1940, this had increased to 280, and by 1945, it was over 720. Between 1939 and 1945, 444 new airfields were built by these organizations, an astonishing feat by anybody's standard. This map is just of the part of the East Anglia from North Lincolnshire down to almost down to Boscombe Down and Dover and Calais. The blue fields are the Royal Air Force, the green fields are the United States Army Air Force fields, and the yellow fields were joint use. The northernmost yellow is Royal Air Force Base Goxhill, that of course was turned over to the United States Army Air Forces and became the very first United States Army Air Forces base that was fully owned and operated by the American airmen. If you think about 60 military airfields in 39, 720 in 1945, it's so typical of post-war. Okay, let's now beat the swords back into plowshares, that they were back down to precisely 60 in the 1960s. Okay, so building 720 airfields took 160 million square yards of concrete. That's the equivalent of a road 30 feet wide from London to Peking, according to the UK-based Airfield Research Group. Their excellent research paper called, of course, 9,000 Miles of Concrete, calculated that the stone aggregate alone for that concrete would equate to a convoy of commercial dump trucks that nose to tail would stretch 1.5 times around the world at the equator. Over 1 million prefabricated buildings, not unlike the Nissan hut now sitting next to the watch office at the museum. Over 1 million of these were built during the war for everything from hospitals to theaters to PXs and all the other typical usages of buildings on the air bases. The typical heavy airfield would require over 50 miles of underground and pole-mounted lighting for its aircraft pattern. According to the ARG, this effort alone accounted for 9,000 miles of trenching, 12,000 miles of overhead wiring, and 500,000 wooden poles. At the peak of all of this activity, new airfields were becoming available at the rate of one every 3 days. Absolutely astonishing. Almost a third of Britain's total construction labor force was involved in this mammoth effort. A further challenge was that all of these airfield runways were increasingly unsuitable for the new and heavier aircraft being fielded. During the war, runways were consistently being lengthened and strengthened. With each new development in aircraft and maximum gross weight or carriage tonnage and engines, planes were running off the runways or sinking through the macadam or the tarmac or the concrete, and required constant redesign and increased thickness to support the weight. Concrete could not be poured quickly enough in the English weather to build new fields and to keep the old ones operating. All manner of tracking was used. We're familiar with the Marston matting or PSP, pierced steel planking. Anything that would keep the planes from sinking through the runway was being used. The 390th Bomb Group, operating out of RAF Framlingham, or also known as RAF Perham, which was also given to the USAAF later in the war. They had B-17s, typical of the airfields, operating increasingly heavily laden aircraft. Their records from 1944, their squadron daybook, indicates that with limited available manpower for the work, the problem of keeping the repairs ahead of the disintegration of the runways was a very serious one. This photo was taken just a few years ago, and it shows the Gox Hill Air Base being gradually subsumed back into the countryside from which it came. The village of Goxhill is at the bottom of the photograph. The River Humber, you can see, is just 30 seconds flying time from taking off from the base. The River Humber, and on the opposite side, the city of Hull, are but a short walk from the domestic sites of the airfield. It's easy to imagine this as a pre-war photo of exactly the kind of site that the Directorate of Works for the Air Ministry was looking. Flat, open fields, good drainage, good transport capacity. Goxhill, in fact, is the only airbase that I'm aware of that actually had platforms of two different rail lines that touched the edge of the airbase. The men and women who were stationed at Goxhill had unparalleled access to weekend leaves to London or Edinburgh or almost anywhere else. RAF Goxhill is a thoroughly typical example of the expansion period works. There were 136 primary contractors handling 800 different contracts to build airfields. Can you just imagine the life of the poor schmuck at the Air Ministry that had to manage all of those different contractors to the same standard? John Lang and Son was one of the busiest builders of airfields, and it was that company that built RAF Goxhill. Here we have a 1942 photograph of Goxhill. It has not quite been finished yet. It's early 1942, but you can see two of the three runways in this photo. The third is just off to the right. The main administrative area, or what's called the technical sites, where everybody worked in the daytime, is right below there. If you see three small buildings closest to the runways, the one in the middle is the Goxhill Watch Office. The technical sites are where the classrooms, motor pool, all of those kinds of facilities were. The main gate is at the bottom right of the photograph. The domestic sites where everyone sort of lived is off to the left of the photograph. People had to walk or bicycle 2 miles or more to get from where they were sleeping to where they were living. That's why bicycles went very dear. That was the first purchase almost every American made. So John Lang and Son began construction of RAF Goxhill in North Lincolnshire in October of 1940. It was handed over to the RAF on June 26, 1941. Both of these photos were taken in the 41-42 period. Because I can't afford to get into but so many topics, I won't bring this up later, but if you look at this photograph at exactly the intersection of the two primary runways, is where the Luftwaffe famously planted a single bomb that went down so deep into that wet clay that was never dug up until I believe sometime around 1947. General Eisenhower showed up at the field just a few hours later for the initial sort of informal handover of the airfields, and it was based on his command that the disposal crew simply plowed it over and repaved the runway instead of trying to dig it up and risk killing a bunch of people. That attack was in fact predecessed by a warning from Axis Sally. Boy, I'd love to have some documentation on that one. But she said to the RAF Goxhill or the USAAF Goxhill at the time to expect your new boys to have a visitor. And within 48 hours, they did. So one of the keys, obviously, to building all these airfields was that the Air Ministry had a large number of, I mean, literally hundreds of standardized plans for every single imaginable structure that would be needed for a bomber station, fighter station, main station, satellite field, sector control, doesn't matter. Every single built was accompanied by architectural plans built to the most economic possible for the duration or temporary construction using the materials that were available in every locality. The bricks of the Goxhill control tower were made of clay dug in Goxhill. This was a very local sort of cottage industry, even though they had very large general contractors. The Air Ministry plan for Goxhill is shown here. This was brought to us by Mick Parker of Goxhill, England, and we'll talk a little bit about him later. but this is the original Air Ministry schematic for the entire actual Gox Hill Air Base, including legends down the side that shows each and every building on it. The red square, sort of in the middle toward the left, is the control tower today. This had been digitized at some time in the past. It had not been digitized well, and a lot of our volunteers spent a great deal of time photoshopping this to clean it up for display to our guests. So every single building already had a plan. They went up very quickly. These bases were in fact small cities of up to 2,500 men and women, with all the support services and infrastructure that you can possibly imagine. Now, having been designed originally by the Air Ministry for a bomber command station, a heavy Class A station for the Royal Air Force, it had 3 intersecting runways, the longest at 1,600 by 50 yards. And at the outbreak of the war, those were already insufficient for the newer bombers coming in to service, like the Wellington, let alone the heavies, like the later on Lancaster. So it was already, even though it was brand new, just been built, was insufficient for RAF Bomber Command's use. The British construction of aircraft was going much slower than the production of airfields, and the RAF never used Goxhill at all, except for temporary tow target or satellite fields. This photograph was taken from the roof of the Goxhill control tower during the RAF's brief occupancy. It was never operational from a combat scenario. You see several Lizzies, Lysanders, and a Miles Master. The Lizzies were used to tow aerial target sleeves. So the RAF found Goxhill to be surplus to needs. It was perfectly geographically located north of the main combat area. So when the Americans started putting the 8th Air Force together in England, it was readily available in the right place and of the right size. So the RAF turned the base over to the Americans in the spring of 1942, just as the first handfuls of aircrew and planes were arriving on steamships. Many of the men that first occupied Goxhill came over on the Queen Mary into Scotland, or via later on the famous WWII air routes over the North Atlantic as Goxhill's P-38s arrived. And I believe they were the first airplanes ferried, first combat aircraft ferried across the North Atlantic, at least in terms of P-38s, were the ones that arrived at Goxhill. So as the Americans began trickling into the nascent USAAF Goxhill field, Goxhill was the perfect candidate, very badly needed in-theater training airfield for the arriving American fighter planes. So on the 10th of June, 1942, American aircrew found themselves getting off a train in the middle of the night, wondering just where in the hell they were. And the train station master told them they were at Goxhill. So thus begins the storied 8th and 9th United States Army Air Forces. While I don't want this to delve too deeply into specific dates and actions, it's useful just for a moment to consider the first few months of World War II from the American perspective. Of course, the British had been at war already for much of the previous 3 years and had gained extraordinary experience at great cost. American military leaders had, of course, planned extensively for war, but until the economic trigger could be pulled on the arsenal of democracy by an act of war on the United States, the awesome might of American resources and manpower was not yet directly in play. One thing the leaders did concentrate on was seconding American officers to their British counterparts, especially in the Royal Air Force. By the time America actually got into the war, the American brass had been extremely good students. They had made every effort in almost all cases to generate very positive personal relationships between them and their soon-to-be British counterparts. And this was an effort that led to intensely cooperative efforts between the RAF and the United States Army Air Forces that paid huge dividends as things began to ramp up. Now, consider the fact that in the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the American forces in the Pacific, obviously because that's where things began, had already delivered the Doolittle raid and had already won the Battle of Midway. In England, after 6 months, the only things that really happened is Brigadier General Ira Aker and a handful of staff officers had gotten off a plane outside of London, set up their headquarters. They had no airplanes, no air crews, and just one American airfield. Yes, Goxhill. By the end of the next year, however, the United States Army Air Forces would have 4,000 aircraft and 185,000 men in combat in England, an organizational and industrial feat of the highest order. Now, I'm sure there's some cackling going on in the background, and just because this is an overwhelmingly Navy town, and just because our volunteer corps is overwhelmingly Navy, I'm not going to pretend that everything went in the Pacific so swimmingly simply because it was the Navy and not the United States Army Air Forces. Okay, as the RAF had built but never fully equipped Goxhill, and this is a map of the entirety of the 8th Air Force installations in August of 1942. Up in the red box, up in the north part of the combat area is Goxhill. The Goxhill was never fully kitted out, as it were. It was never set up with light paths or with the requirements for nighttime bombing, because the Americans were operating by daylight. So the Americans inherited, communications equipment and a lot of basic equipment that they had to fend for themselves in an awful lot of cases. Goxhill was described by the Americans as filthy, unfinished, and completely unorganized, but it did serve well. It trained literally thousands of young Americans in the art of war, especially when you consider these kids had just finished their flight training. And it no doubt saved the lives of countless Americans as they used their time there to gather experience in the many areas that their just finished training had not prepared them for. In the beginning of the war, the entirely new units were coming directly to Goxhill, getting off their steamers in Clyde, Scotland, or flying over the North Atlantic. Entire new groups, new planes, new pilots. A lot of these pilots found entirely different airplanes on the ground at Goxhill than they'd ever been trained on, ever. And then as soon as they completed their 60 days or so at Goxhill and went to their own operational station, they may have found an entirely new airplane that, again, they needed to train up on. Some of those orientation flights became first combat flights. But generally, the troops would spend 60 or 90 days at Goxhill learning how to be effective combat pilots to give them a better chance of surviving those first few missions. They went on practice mission, navigation exercise, learned radio communications under the English air traffic control system. Goxhill had a very excellent gunnery platform and gunnery school and practice range off the coast, just 5 minutes flying time from Goxhill over the English Channel or the North Sea at Withensea. One of the most famous pilots, actually the best scoring P-51 pilot in all of the European Air War, learned to shoot at Goxhill. He was about to be taken off of flight status because he wasn't all that good at firing the 50 calibers. So he learned his trade and became the single best pilot in the European theater at Goxhill. In 1944, later on, when no entirely new units needed to come over and be trained, Goxhill switched gears slightly, becoming the 496 Fighter Training Group, a combat crew replacement center. So this was not now new groups coming over. This was just training classes of newly qualified pilots that needed some operational training and needed some vetting and basically a finishing school from which they were then sorted out based on group attrition as what used to be called a REPL-DEPL, the Combat Crew Replacement Center. So for about a year, Goxhill trained a continuous flow of new pilots to be assigned to new units. Other training documents for docents have already covered the details of these operations, so we're not going to repeat them here. Now, Goxhill was supposedly located out of the main combat area for safety, and it was in fact out of reach of most of the German fighters, unless they were carrying a belly tank and only planning on spending 5 minutes. But during the war, certainly the most constant bombing raids from Germany were in southern England due to the narrowness there of the English Channel. But because of the proximity of the target-rich environment in the port city of Hull, just literally within sight of the Goxhill Airfield and Hull's many docklands, refineries, and manufacturing sites, Goxhill had more than its share of attention from the Luftwaffe. The city of Hull, just across the Humber River from Goxhill, has been termed by several authorities the second most bombed city in England after London, and the several very large and strategic docks were a mere 4 miles from the Goxhill Airfield. This P-38 is indicative of the aircraft that were used at Goxhill. If you've ever seen a photograph of the Goxhill Airfield Memorial with its bent propeller blade, this is the plane that caused the death of Second Lieutenant Lane Ferrara, whose propeller blade is on the memorial centerpiece. I simply had to throw this photograph in to show what pilots were doing at Goxhill. And I can get away with that because I used to be a pilot and I know how pilots behave when they're not flying. But this photograph was actually taken before this group actually even got any airplanes in October of '42, so they can be excused. This is a Luftwaffe target map of Kingston upon Hull, directly across the river from Goxhill, and you can see the proliferation of very juicy targets. Those of you who have done a fair amount of flying remember that clouds tend to form over land before they form over water. The River Humber was an east-west watery superhighway that would stand out like a sore thumb even before you had crossed the English Channel. It would glisten in the sunshine, and even if the land was covered by clouds, the River Humber would be there like this brown, green, dirty arrow saying bomb here, which is no doubt, along with the target selection, the reason for the frequency of the attacks. More than 50 documented raids of significance attacked the easily located city and its river that came straight in like a superhighway. Many of these bombs were, quote, parachute mines, end quote. That sounds rather dinky until you see a photograph of one and the kind of damage it can do. This is one of the homes in Goxhill that was hit by a parachute mine that drifted with the winds, having been dropped on Hull. 22,000 pounds makes a heck of a parachute mine. Sergeant B.P. Henderson of Kentucky joined the Army Air Force in May of '42, and he was taken with 22,000 other troops aboard the Queen Mary ocean liner from New York Harbor to the Firth of Clyde in Scotland. He's one of those that arrived at 1 a.m. in Goxhill on July 1st, 1943. On his very first day at Goxhill, he wrote, quote, "The Germans welcomed us to our new home with an air raid. This was to become routine. Every night the moon was out, we would have from 1 to 3 raids. The sky was lit up with searchlights, heavy ack-ack, and smaller guns. The tracers looked like drops of blood going up. It seemed as though we were in a teepee lit up with aircraft batteries and searchlights all around. I said to myself, dear Lord, I am in your hands." Hull, Immingham, and Grimsby were the main targets. We could see the huge red flashes and smoke and flames from the exploding bombs. They appeared to be really close. There were enemy planes over our base as the searchlight was picking them up, and in the dark, you didn't know if you were going to be blown up in the next instant. So much for the relative safety of North Lincolnshire. Many homes in and around Goxhill were damaged or destroyed by these mines that were dropped either inaccurately in the dark or drifted under their canopies away from their intended targets. Because of this activity, many children in Goxhill and London and Coventry and everywhere were put on trains and taken away from their families and sent with just a little brown cardboard suitcase and a piece of paper with their name and address on it, and sent out on evacuee trains into the western countryside to live with other families or on farms. The scene was duplicated all over England, and in some cases, it's documented that the family of these children didn't know where they wound up or who they were living with for several months until the record keeping and the mails caught up. So let's turn our attention to the world's finest example of the iconic World War II control tower, the one that formerly belonged to the Goxhill Air Base. The evolution of the Watch Office building started in World War I aviation and has been covered brilliantly by the Airfield Research Group's history that can be found in the museum library or online at the ARG site. The Air Ministry's 518-40 was the design number for the largest such plan of the war for a Watch Office building, and that is the building we have. It is a very commodious structure by the standards of the day. As the war went on, a variety of smaller designs were built but as it had been planned for a Class A RAF Bomber Command sector station, the Goxhill Watch Office was sturdy and was probably a bit palatial for the needs of a fighter training base, but nobody was complaining. So how did the museum come to acquire this particular example? And here we see a photograph of it in the, I believe, in the mid 1990s. The Gox Hill Air Base at that time was generally considered by most authorities to be the finest World War II air base in terms of the condition it was still in. It was not used except for briefly a few years after the war by the Ministry of Defense to store bombs and fire engines, some other odds and ends. It was one of the first bases to be returned to agriculture and sold to a farmer. You can see the control tower sitting at the division of the yellow and the green there in front of the hangars. All three of those hangars, by the way, are still there. You can go on Google Earth and see them today. They've actually been reworked and they look like they're brand new. Quite a few of the other subsidiary buildings remain, but not necessarily in that good a condition. The brilliant yellow crop, for those of you who have been to England, is visually stunning. It's called rape. Rape seed produces an oil that's used in the food industry and agriculture and machinery, all kinds of things. And it's just an absolutely stunning sight to come over a hill and see hundreds of square yards of this planted. The vast majority of these after the war were, of course, surplus to requirements, and entire airfields disappeared back under the plow or to industrial uses. The temporary buildings that our volunteers will remember were not even built with mortar between the bricks, it was just more concrete, eventually succumbed to the elements, bad water leakage. They were only supposed to last 5 or 6 years. And by the 1990s, most of them were being used rather ingloriously to store fodder for livestock or meet the other storage needs of various businesses. Even at RAF Goxhill, even at RAF bases around North Lincolnshire that contained the same kind of layout, the buildings were entirely insufficient for military use. Vast numbers were demolished within just a few decades of the war's end. So in the 1990s, Goxhill was a good candidate for looking for historic buildings. There was actually a very temporary move afoot to return Goxhill to a sort of historic presence by restoring it, sort of like a colonial Williamsburg of the air war in World War II. But that didn't last more than about a year and never really got off the ground. But it did result in some excellent record keeping from a historical perspective. Even today, as I said, you can look at Google Earth, you can still see the traces of the runways, the hard stands, the perimeter tracks. It's very haunting. Only one building is missing, and that's, of course, the one that now stands in Virginia. We have excellent photographs of Goxhill from the war, from the 1990s, that show the full scope of the base. We have the hundreds of photographs from the collection of the late Goxhill resident and historian Ron Parker as well. There's another photograph of the tower and its night flying equipment and the fire tender buildings that were the buildings closest to the runways, with just more farm fields and the village in the background. Museum founder Jerry Yeagan let it be known to a few sources in the UK that he was looking to obtain an example of an iconic World War II control tower. And he became aware through some proxies of the Goxhill Airfield. The owner of the property was interested in turning various parts into more useful business and industrial uses, and an agreement was reached to acquire and demolish the watch office and bring it to the museum. There is a series of photographs showing the condition just before the building was taken down. All very evocative. Of course, all the timbers were rotted away. The windows, as our volunteers know, were pretty much shot. The metalwork was gone and couldn't be salvaged or retasked. Looking at one of the hangars that still stands from the watch office windows. And there she is, all but taken down. A site analysis of the building was done, and architectural drawings were done by an engineer to facilitate the reconstruction at a later date. So perhaps uniquely for any such building, we know how the Air Ministry intended it to look, because we've got those plans. We know through later plans what it actually looked like as constructed by John Langham's son. And finally, we also have plans for what it looked like under American usage because of a unique set of plans created in the 1990s by the fighting scouts of the U.S. Army Air Force that trained at Goxhill. And they found people to tell them what the Americans left it looking like. And I'll let that mystery hang in the air because we really don't have time to go into it. But we've learned a few interesting things about some perhaps future changes to the Goxhill Tower. Another invaluable research for the museum has been Mr. Ian Reed, who lives in Grimsby, just a few miles from Goxhill. Ian has always been interested in all things related to the period, and he actually spent, I believe, about a year working every day at the Goxhill Airfield with the mission of documenting, measuring, and photographing the entire base and its buildings to prepare for that project that was later abandoned to turn it into a historic attraction. So Ian has shared with us the dimensions and a lot of other information of every single building on that complex. Perhaps the single most valuable personality involved in the project over the years is the late Ron Parker, a lifelong resident of Goxhill. Ron grew up in Goxhill as a young boy during the war, and he made it his mission later to collect photographs and letters from servicemen and women who worked at Goxhill, both as the RAF and U.S. Army Air Forces. Ron gave complete access to the museum of his collection. We have hundreds of photographs, wartime photographs of Goxhill. Unfortunately, not very many of the control tower that show us a great deal, but very evocative photographs. Ron's son Mick continues his father's work, and Mick visited us a few years ago at Warbirds Over the Beach. An almost providential resource was provided just as the museum and its contractor were seriously preparing to reconstruct the watch office. While we had the plans and the photographs, much of the actual how to actually put it back together information was purely conjecture. The previously mentioned ARG, the Airfield Research Group, had just completed a project on behalf of another nonprofit group who also wanted to restore exactly the same type of 518-40 with Met section watch office as ours. They'd studied all of the remaining types still standing in England, measured them, photographed them, and they'd written a 79-page study on the construction methods, the layouts, the room contents, major equipment. Based on that, they'd even created a full set of 3D CAD drawings and layouts that you can see here. And the ARG was kind enough to gift us that 79-page study completely free, exactly at the juncture when we needed it the most. So now we had the parts and we had the manual. So thank you, ARG, for this Rosetta Stone. Now, many of our volunteers also remember the indefatigable Carol DeSola, who was Mr. Yegan's scrounger in chief, off and on for a period of several years with all things Goxhill. Carol is a warbird owner and pilot herself. She haunted other museums, boot sales, thrift shops, and eBay on our behalf for several years, hunting down literally hundreds of artifacts for the Watch Office project all over the UK. Those historic finds now make our watch office, even though the project is nowhere near completed, the most completely authentic control tower in the world from what I've seen from the World War II period. Mr. Yegan wanted this museum from day one, I believe, to be a genuine guest experience that was a bit extraordinary. It was to have a minimum of distracting interpretive offerings and displays so that the guests felt that they were actually walking through a historic masterpiece. Most of the other remaining watch offices that have actually become museums in the UK, and there's only about 10, the watch offices themselves are the museums in most cases, and they're crammed with photographs and display cases and signage because the building is the museum. Thanks to Mr. Yegan's foresight and this beautiful campus we have, we can keep the watch office historically correct as much as possible with a minimum of distractions that would not have been in the building during the war, because we have other places to do those things. So the various components and materials from the watch office stayed in storage for several years after bringing them to Virginia, while plans for engineering the site were started. Beginning, I believe, around 2014, a full decade after removing the building from England, the foundations were poured on the newly prepared site alongside the museum's runway, and progress proceeded apace. 3 years later, in the fall of 2017, the building was essentially completed and the challenge of equipping and furniture the interior began. In the photograph on the lower left there, you see the windows being reinstalled. Of course, the original windows were completely shot. The original manufacturer, Crittall, just outside of London, was still in business, and Mr. Yegan persuaded them to reach into their history cabinet, find the original plans, and put together a fresh set of completely authentic windows and door frames for the building, which only add, of course, to this remarkable structure. Now, because Gox Hill had obviously been operational to some degree under the RAF and designed and built by the RAF, we wanted to honor both services in our watch office. So it was decided to make the ground floor indicative of the American experience and have the upper floor be representative of the British design and operation. We need to be careful as volunteers and docents to point this out to guests. We don't want them to wind up believing that the RAF was upstairs and the Americans were downstairs at bases all over England. It wasn't even the case at Goxhill, but we want to show them both. Since most of our guests are primarily interested in the American operation, we're putting that on the ground floor because some percentage of our guests may never be able to get to the upper floor. So the story of how the various rooms have been furnished is beyond the scope of this, but let's just take a walk through of some of the highlights. What you see here is the Nissen hut from RAF Rivenhall, also a RAF base given over to the Americans to fly B-26s. We all know the iconic Nissen hut as the briefing hut, the sleeping hut. It is hoped that at some point in the future, this might become a briefing room experience to brief our museum guests on the Gox Hill experience. The Goxhill Watch Office itself is a building with very small rooms, even tinier hallways, and it's something of a rabbit warren that's difficult to give a good experience to our guests in the building itself, except for answering specific questions. So one potential approach might be to have a docent stationed or ultimately an audiovisual presentation so that guests can self-brief on the watch office before going into it, so that they can then simply enjoy the experience and engage with the docents on specifics rather than generalities. As you first go into the watch office, you encounter the duty officer's rest room. That's not the same restroom as the loo or the water closet. It's literally where, since you might be on duty for up to 24 hours, it was a crash pad, in this case for the duty officer. The duty officer was the only flight qualified person in the control tower. Everybody else was engaged in weather or air traffic control. Duty pilot's job was not only to coordinate all air operations, but to make sure the rest of the people in this building weren't telling somebody to do something dangerous because they weren't pilots. As we acquire more display items and have the security to allow the displays, we'll put additional flying equipment, clothing, period magazines, and a lot more accoutrement into these rooms to make the experience even a little bit more real. The Met office or weather office with a teletype room is the next office that the guest sees on the first floor. This office is chock full of original 1940s government issue weather equipment, charting desks, map cases, desks, telephones, all kinds of actual equipment from World War II. There are very few things in this building that don't have either the government broad arrow stamp or the Air Ministry stamp or the RAF stamp, because everything in this building is 75 to 80 years old with a handful of exceptions. The watch office is not just the name of the tower, it's also the name of the main room on the ground floor. Up until this particular style of watch office, which was 2 stories, the watch office was always on the only floor, the ground floor, and in the front with all the glass. So this is actually the Goxhill Watch Office. We have not furnished it yet because we have not been able to find suitable photographs of American installations for control rooms, but we have solved that quandary in just the last month or so, and we are now prepared to move forward with this particular room. This is a photograph that was given to Mr. Yegan some time ago, a photograph taken by Bill Carlisle, who is shown on the bottom left there with his face to the operations board. He was the flying control officer at USAAF Thurley, exactly the same kind of watch office as Goxhill. And what you see in the two photographs up top is the second floor of the Goxhill style watch office as it was equipped at U.S. Army Air Force's base, Thurley. So that will be our roadmap. Upstairs, you have the Met officer's bedroom. All of these rooms have the same absolutely lovely British government pea green and awful ochre. And you see a temporary example of a blackout curtain that we will hope to provide to the rest of the building in the not too distant future. Two of the rooms in the control tower or watch office have been reserved for more traditional museum exhibits. We don't want, typical museum gear to interfere with the historic tableaus of most of the other rooms. But two rooms we have set aside. This is the control officer's rest room. It would have just been a third example of a rest room. We didn't need that. So this room houses relics and tells the story of the American and Royal Air Force bases with some artifacts from Rivenhall, from Gox Hill, and others. Across the hall, we have the signals office, which would have been just a room full of very hot, very large, very heavy radios. And we're really not a signals museum. So this room tells the story of the home front. And all of our volunteers and docents know as much as they probably need to know about this room right now, but hopefully we'll tell our museum guests what it was like to live under nightly attack from an enemy who was only 20 miles away across the English Channel. Of course, the heartbeat of the control tower or watch office is the control room upstairs. This is another building exactly like Gox Hill's, not very far from Gox Hill, built by the same contractor as Gox Hill. So this was our best roadmap 5 years ago when we began thinking about outfitting Gox Hill. And we have found what we can. We are making what we can't. Obviously, this massive control desk was not something we were going to find, so extremely talented volunteers undertook the recreation of that desk, and that is what you see here. This is still a work in progress, but it probably presents a watch office from World War II in a more correct setting with more correct equipment in a more correct building than you're going to find anywhere in the world. We could go on for another 20 minutes, but we're not going to because Keegan's finger is poised above the red button, I'm sure. So Keegan, let me hand it back over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. I think we've all appreciated the kind of walk through Gox Hill history this evening. If it's okay with you, we'll start to take a few questions. Folks out there, you're welcome to enter your questions into the question window. We'll give people a couple minutes to do that. Mike, if while they're doing that, you'll field a couple from me. My big question through this whole presentation really has been what constitutes abnormal fog in the United Kingdom? You mentioned that they were trying to avoid areas of abnormal fog, and I guess I just didn't really realize there was such a thing.
Well, I think the wartime British description, I'm not sure if it's the official Air Ministry description, clear above and visibility unlimited meant that the air was clear from 12 inches above the ground down.
All right, then. While we're waiting for a few more folks to enter their questions, question for you. If I wanted to support the restoration project itself and give directly to the Gox Hill Tower, how might I do that? Mike, are you still with us?
I'm sorry, I tried to unmute and it didn't work.
Oh, okay. How might I contribute to the restoration project directly? There's possibly a couple ways. I understand that Gox Hill bricks are available as part of a package that recognizes donors at, I think it's the $100 level. Is that right?
That is correct. An original Gox Hill brick, as well as a 35-page booklet on Gox Hill and a certificate of authenticity, are all available to help support the future endeavors of the Gox Hill Control Tower. There, I'm sure, are places on the website for the museum that you can go to find the address. And then there's also a paper bag and a tree about 100 yards south of the Gox Hill control tower with my name on it.
Well, hopefully no one's visiting the museum at the moment while the facility is closed to find the paper bag. I did drop a donation link into the chat window. If you'd like to make a contribution specifically to Gox Hill, simply attach that in the comments and we'll ensure that it is earmarked for use with the continued restoration of the tower. And if you are interested in the book or procuring your very own Gox Hill brick and certificate of authenticity, you can call the museum gift shop at 757-721-7767. Okay, with all that said, we do have a bunch of questions here, so I'm going to start posing a couple of them to you, Mike. First question here, was there much of a difference between the original Ministry 518/40 plans and the final construction that occurred at Goxhill?
That's a very good question. Obviously, to the extent that materials were limited to whatever were available in the vicinity, obviously there were a lot of minor differentiations. Our Goxhill control tower has a timbered floor on the second floor in the first half of the control room because it's that timber that supports the beams that go out to the balcony, the famous 12 o'clock high Robert Lansing kind of balcony. But there were also those built with completely being in concrete. Just a lot of little differences. The interesting differences came in the United States Army Air Forces. We have a set of plans that indicate that were drawn in the 1995 period by people who trained at Goxhill that indicated that the little cupola up on the roof was actually enclosed and glassed in, as is seen much more typically at a lot of other American bases in World War II England, and was used as a third area for observation up on the roof with even better visibility. So I think our control tower looked a lot more like what we're used to seeing at other American bases than we've ever known before.
Okay. Another question we've got here relates to deconflicting operations at bases that were so close to each other. You mentioned that you could blink and miss your base. Was there a system in place to deconflict all of that traffic over those various fields?
Well, like any other government operation, the air traffic control came over from the civilian operations in the 1930s. It was adapted for military use, and there was no shortage of regulations. I'm not sure the regulations made a great deal of difference because communications at the time were a challenge. As our volunteers know, ATC communications were not used much when a mission was beginning. They weren't worrying about it when it was ending because the enemy already knew where you were at that point anyway. But a lot of the signals had to be done by, Very pistols and Aldous lamps and signal rockets and things like that. So a lot of the protocols went by the wayside. I have I had a communication about 2 weeks ago from a gentleman who served in World War II with the United States Army Air Forces. He was forced to land away from his regular field because of combat damage. And in the late afternoon, they attempted to fly him back to his field. The sun went down during the hour-long flight, and they found themselves flying through a return convoy of C-47 paratroop planes and missed at least 6 of them by only a few feet or more. So I think it's probably pretty much what it was like all over England. Of course, they managed to scatter the airfields as much as possible because the Americans were flying in the daytime and the RAF was flying at night. So that gave them a 50-50 chance, at least in some parts.
All right. You mentioned that there was a discussion at one time about a kind of colonial Williamsburg of World War II aviation. Were there any RAF or U.S. Army Air Forces airfields restored to that kind of World War II status post-war in the UK?
No, none that I've ever seen. I think the best example today in England of a World War II airfield that sort of looks like a World War II airfield is the Imperial War Museum's facility at Duxford, England, because the control tower is original. Probably at least 20 or 30 of the buildings are original. Some massive, gleaming steel and chrome buildings are in the middle of it, but you do get a wonderful sense of the wartime environment For those of you who've seen that wonderful 1960s film, Battle of Britain, that's the airfield that the movie was filmed on in terms of the RAF field being bombed with the Heikel bombs exploding and Spitfires and Hurricanes exploding, and one very large RAF hangar disappearing in a ball of dynamite that was not the original plan, according to the British.
Okay. We've got a question here relating to the photos that were taken at Gox Hill before the watch office was removed and brought here to Virginia Beach. What are the two small brick structures that were next to the watch office that appeared to have once held overhead doors?
One, I believe the one closest to the watch office or control tower is the fire crash tender. The combination hook and ladder truck and a couple of fire bottles. And the building next to that was for the night flying equipment, or the NFE building. These airfields at the time did not have in-ground electric lighting either on the runway or the taxiway. And the most prominent vehicle in that NFE shed would have been a flatbed truck with a huge, what looks like a Vepco wooden reel for cable that had rope tied to it. And along that massive rope, every 50 feet was a hand lit paraffin burning signal lamp. And once the active runway was determined, it was some poor airman's job to drive that truck while another poor airman unreeled the rope line along the side of the runway. And yet another IRC had to take a book of matches and light them all. And of course, by that time, the wind would have changed and they had to blow it out and go to another runway and start all over again.
Okay. Can you talk to us a little bit about the ARG, the Airfield Research Group? We obviously owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude as an institution for supporting the ongoing work with the tower. What's its composition? Are they based in the US, in the UK?
The Airfield Research Group is a group of professional architects, builders, and other enthusiasts who spend their weekends driving all around the UK to old military bases to document, to photograph, to draw out, to make plans for, and to learn from all of these buildings on all of these Royal Air Force and other military installations all over the UK before they completely rot out. They have a full selection, a wonderful library. We've learned more about Nissen huts and some of their publications than I thought there was possible to know. And they have documents on all of the various buildings at all of the various parts of the country, everything from camouflage patterns to you name it. For those of you who are interested, I believe it's just airfieldgroup.co.uk, but if you Google Airfield Research Group, you will find it very quickly. They are indeed good friends of ours. They're very proud of their participation in this. And being a member of the ARG is a very worthwhile endeavor.
Well, they've certainly been a vital support to this entire process. We've got a question here asking why the Mustang appears to have nose gear in the image that's being displayed right at the moment. Just to clear this up for everyone, that is a trick owing to the positioning of the Mustang in the photo. We do not have a Mustang here with a fitted nose gear. Just to sort that out for everyone real quick.
But a brief comment about that P-51, because a lot of people on the call may not know this. Bill Bailey, the pilot of Double Trouble and Double Trouble 2, was based at Goxhill, hence the photograph.
So, Mike, in addition to the P-38s and P-51s, were there other fighter aircraft types routinely stationed at Goxhill?
Everything was there at some point. The P-38s were the first ones to be flown across the North Atlantic. They flew P-40s, they flew P-39s, they flew an A-20 there. Virtually everything from an L-5 to a B-17 would be seen there at one point, not operational, but used for utility or liaison. We even have photographs of Spitfires with America stars and bars on them being used as late as, I believe, 1944.
Okay, we've got a question here relating to continuing process with the restoration project. Naturally, one of our goals is to be able to find a way to provide an equivalent experience for those with different abilities in terms of being able to access that upper floor. The limitations of the structure are such that we really wouldn't be able to add an elevator or anything like that without a significant departure from the original structure of the tower. But that being said, Mike, can you talk a little bit about some of the efforts that are planned for the lower level to really bring to life a similar experience down on the main floor that we've been constructing on the upper floor?
Well, we don't have any spare rooms on the ground floor to be able to put, sort of generic museum displays. But at the very least, I'm hopeful that if people cannot get up those rather constricting stairs, even though we widened them from the original by 6 inches, uh, we will have a photographic representation of everything that's on the second floor available for our guests to look at down on the ground floor. And at some point, as resources make themselves available, I think it would be a wonderful idea to have a touchscreen computer where somebody can actually look at either video or photographs of everything in the entire tower.
Certainly, I think it's our goal to ultimately provide an equivalent experience for everyone, independent of their ability to make it up those stairs. There's a fantastic view from up on the third floor, which isn't open to the public because of the height of the railings being below the required safe height for such a railing with modern building code and regulations. So I think we'd like to be able to provide that view to everyone as well. Another question we have here, though, Mike, relates to the effort to actually rebuild it. Once the bricks and everything arrived here in the United States, it was clear that not all of them met the sort of structural conditions required of modern building materials. Can you talk a little bit about the efforts to clean the bricks and make them suitable for the construction?
That was a very long and arduous process with a lot of things tried and not necessarily all being successful. As I mentioned earlier, when these temporary buildings were built, they did not use mortar between the bricks. They just used more concrete. So it was not physically possible to get the bricks apart. When actually deconstructing the building, it simply had to be knocked down, and all of the chunks of 1,001 different sizes simply being brought over and stored in Virginia until we were ready to put it back together. All of those components were dumped rather unceremoniously where the tower now stands. And a fairly large group of people were hired to come in and try to physically separate the bricks with, masonry saws to be able to use as many of the bricks as possible. And that was done to some degree, but the simple fact that the building had been knocked down meant that every fracture line where pieces of the building came apart was a whole series of bricks that had been shattered and would never be able to be used again. Now, of course, just like British automotive parts, there is absolutely no commonality in size, dimension, structure, or anything else between a World War II British brick and an American brick. So Mr. Yegan had to find a brickyard here in Virginia who would undertake the specifications of the much larger and completely different British style bricks. So that was a delaying factor in the construction as well. I don't honestly know. I guess that's information we could find out what the percentage of original versus replacement bricks are. But I do know that almost everywhere you look in the tower, since they're all painted and in some places they have a fair coat over them, everywhere you can physically see a brick, you can tell very quickly whether it's original or a replacement because the replacements are very clean, very precise, and the old ones look old.
Thank you for answering that question that I think's been on a lot of our minds. There's a kind of a folkloric story around the museum and among a lot of the volunteers that would suggest that after the watch office was removed and brought here to Virginia Beach, that laws were instituted in the United Kingdom to forbid that sort of thing from happening again. Have you got any indication about whether or not that's truth or more on the fiction side of things?
I I don't pretend to be an authority on that. I have found absolutely no documentation in the rather voluminous files on this project going back to the late 1990s. I do know that a no small number of Britons were a little miffed when it disappeared, uh, because they do consider it part of their national patronage, and we all understand that. We feel the same way about buildings at Antietam or anywhere else or Yorktown. But given the fact that this is now in far better shape than any of the buildings that remain in England, now that people are seeing this, we've gotten nothing but positive feedback, both from this side of the Atlantic and the other side of the Atlantic. I do know that the owner, obviously more than willingly gave up rights to the building because he preferred to work from a blank slate rather than having to take it down himself. But that doesn't mean that because he had the legal title to it, everybody in the world was happy about it. But I think as time goes on, more and more people are seeing that he's doing very well where it is.
You mentioned that some of the towers have ended up as museums, and certainly that's true, but numbers more of them have ended up as people's houses and so on. A tour of UK airfields is kind of an interesting way to spend a summer because you'll see the watch offices in varying states of repair, often kind of up to the individual ownership of the structure.
Yeah, there's an excellent series of books put together a few years ago called All Along the Control Tower, and I believe there were 3 volumes. We had a nice four-page spread on Goxhill in one of them. And if I remember correctly, probably well more than half of these buildings are gone already. Another 30 to 40% are derelict, and have caved in already, don't have all 4 sides of the building remaining. I'm only aware of about a half a dozen, I believe, that have been um, retrofitted as private dwellings or offices or that sort of thing. So they are extremely rare. There's a lot of corpses around, but there's only probably a dozen to a dozen and a half that you can actually walk into safely.
Well, Mike, with that question answered, that does bring us to the end of the questions for this evening and the end of the Q&A period. Before we part ways, though, one last question perhaps I can help answer is, are there more buildings we'd like to see from elsewhere in the world brought here to Virginia Beach to be installed here at the Military Aviation Museum as part of our complex of World War II structures? The answer to that question is certainly yes, but you will have to wait um, until we're able to reveal what it is we're working on, um, in terms of what else we're going to be bringing here to the museum. So thank you all for participating this evening. Thank you, Mike, for your time. And again, we hope to see you guys on our Thursday night webinar. Mike, thank you so much for being here.
Good night, everybody.